By the end of 1984, Israel was on the verge of economic collapse. Inflation was spiraling out of control, reaching over 400% a year. Supermarket shelves were almost empty. People waited in long lines to buy basic products, while their salaries lost value by the hour. The government controlled prices, rationed goods, and public spending soared to 80% of GDP. The banking system was collapsing, while investors were fleeing. And the national currency, the shekel, was practically worthless. To make things worse, Israel was a tiny, isolated country surrounded by hostile neighbors, with no oil, almost no water, and only 4 million people. It seemed destined for permanent instability, just like the poorest nations of Africa or Latin America. But today, just 4 decades later, Israel ranks among the world's wealthiest countries. It is a global leader in technology, agriculture, cybersecurity, and innovation. Its income per capita is higher than that of the United Kingdom or France, and it has the highest startup-to-population ratio on the planet. But how did a small, resource-poor country, seemingly condemned to failure, become a first-world tech powerhouse in just 1 generation? Today, we'll uncover one of the most unlikely economic transformations in modern history and challenge some of the biggest myths about what truly makes a nation prosperous. To understand the economic miracle of Israel, we first need to know its history up to 1985, when the reforms that eventually transformed it began. In the early and very difficult years of its existence, Israel was seen as the country of the Jewish people, a people trying to create their own state. It was known for being constantly at war with its neighbors. And it was also associated with socialism, not in the Soviet sense of a one-party system and a fully planned economy, but rather with a collectivist economic and social model, heavily regulated, with dominant public ownership. This was the result of the Jewish immigrants who arrived there some years earlier. The first major wave of Jewish migration to their historic land, called the First Aliyah, happened between 1882 and 1903. Due to persecution in the Russian Empire, around 35,000 Jews moved to Palestine, which at that time was a province of the Ottoman Empire. Most of them were religious people who, after emigrating, faced many daily hardships: lack of resources, harsh natural conditions, and no experience in farming life. Many gave up within a few months and returned to their home countries, often suffering from hunger and disease. Israel didn't exist yet, and there was no full economy in place. Between 1904 and 1914, the Second Aliyah took place, when about 40,000 Jews migrated to their historic land after another wave of persecution in Russia and Poland. The new immigrants faced many difficulties, like lack of housing, land, and money, but still laid the foundations of the future state's economy. Many of these immigrants were socialists, which led to the creation of political parties and labor organizations in Palestine. The first kibbutz was also founded in 1909. Kibbutzim are agricultural communes where property is shared and everyone works and consumes equally. The first self-defense organization, Hashomer, was also formed. It protected Jewish settlements from Arab and Bedouin attacks. Then came the First World War, which interrupted this second wave of immigration. But after the war, migration resumed, and the British Mandate was established in Palestine. In December 1920, the Histadrut, the General Federation of Labor Unions, was founded. It provided many services to the Jewish population, including jobs and social benefits. Its goal was to represent the rights of Jewish workers in Palestine under the British Mandate, and to promote the struggle for Jewish labor and Jewish land. In 1922, it had 8,394 members, nearly half of the Jewish working class in Palestine. By 1927, that number had grown to 25,000, or 3/4 of the total. This growth happened during another wave of migration until the British restricted immigration in 1936. The history of the Histadrut matters because it became the institutional base of labor Zionism in Israel. This movement eventually became formalized with the creation of an independent state in 1948, after the Second World War. After founding the State of Israel, the Histadrut, along with the government, came to control about 60% of the economy. There are two more things we need to understand about Israel in those early years. The first is war. From the beginning, Israel lived under constant threats, surrounded by enemies. In such a situation, you can't afford to spend little on defense. But Israel didn't have a strong economy or developed infrastructure. The second thing is constant immigration. New immigrants kept arriving in Israel without pause. In 1948, after the creation of the State of Israel, the population was about 806,000. But 4 years later, that number had already doubled. The government had no choice but to spend money to absorb all these immigrants who arrived with nothing in their pockets. Somehow, they had to be fed, housed, given jobs, and provided with healthcare and education. But of course, this wasn't easy in a young country with no resources, in the middle of the desert. Many immigrants were sent to absorption camps, where they lived in tents or under poor conditions with no running water or other basic services. It's no surprise that in the first years of independence, the government actively regulated prices and limited the consumption of goods. Almost everything, from food to furniture, was controlled by the state. Over time, the situation began to stabilize a little. War reparations came from Germany, along with aid from the United States. The government worked hard to invest in building infrastructure and some industry, but as we said, it spent too much on defense and on absorbing immigrants. So the economy still didn't grow very much. Most companies were state-owned, and the state, along with Histadrut, continued to control the economy. For about 30 years, this was how the Israeli economy worked. The very rich could afford some luxuries, while most people lived with just enough to get by. In the mid-1960s, there was an economic recession, but it was nothing compared to what was coming in the 1970s and early 1980s. A weak state with an underdeveloped economy couldn't handle the economic shocks caused by the Yom Kippur War in 1973 and the Lebanon War in 1982. External circumstances triggered internal chaos. The economy was weak and inefficient. Businesses couldn't keep up, and the government just kept spending. Even raising taxes wasn't enough to fix the situation. So, as often happens, they started printing money to pay for uncontrolled public spending. The result? Inflation over 400% per year. Chaos, shortages, and poverty. It got to the point where people literally rejected the shekel and used only US dollars. People not only didn't trust their currency, they didn't trust the government either. The country was on the edge of collapse. A radical change was needed, a master move to reverse the situation. And that move came from Prime Minister Shimon Peres. It's important to understand that in order to get out of that situation, the economy had to be stabilized, public finances had to be fixed, and inflation had to come down. Macroeconomic stability is the first necessary step for economic growth. Without it, it's hard to plan long-term investments, especially complex projects that only become profitable after 10 years or more. The second step, or condition for that growth, is structural reform, which helps build strong institutions, including those for development. So in 1984, with inflation near 400%, Shimon Peres became prime minister, and the first thing he did was impose strict public finance controls. Loss-making, state-owned companies that were draining the budget were privatized. The salaries of public employees were frozen, and the government stopped covering its deficit by printing money. The budget deficit dropped from 15.5% of GDP in 1984 to a surplus of nearly 3% in 1986. But that wasn't enough. There was no trust in the shekel, and the economy was highly dollarized. In 1984, only 3% of bank deposits were in shekels. Confidence in the national currency had to be restored. And that's when the second big step came. Shimon Peres gave independence back to the Bank of Israel, the central bank. That's simple. Before Peres, the central bank was under government control and basically served its interests. If the government needed shekels to pay its bills, the central bank would just print them, pushing the country to the brink of hyperinflation. From then on, the central bank began to operate independently, and its main mission became controlling inflation. No desperate politician could ask the central bank for money anymore. And it worked.
People began using dollars less, and trust in the shekel returned. The dollar eventually disappeared from the Israeli economy, making way for a stronger national currency. These reforms brought back macroeconomic stability, and inflation fell to between 0 and 2%. The economy grew rapidly in the following years, with average GDP growth close to 5%. In short, prosperity, calm, and economic stability came to Israel. And while that's a necessary condition for a country to become rich, it's not enough. A country can reach middle income by global standards, even without great economic stability or strong institutions. It's enough to develop some industry and start looking a bit like a modern economy. What's truly hard is making sure that once a country reaches a nominal GDP per capita of around $10,000 to $15,000, which is considered a moderately rich country, the growth keeps going and doesn't fall into the middle income trap. There are many examples of countries stuck in that trap. For example, Malaysia, Mexico, Thailand, or Brazil. These are countries that built a solid industrial base but have been stuck for years, unable to keep growing and become rich. A mix of corruption, bureaucracy, lack of clear vision, and weak human capital are usually the causes of that stagnation. Very few countries manage to grow steadily beyond that point and become wealthy. Israel's great achievement was that it kept growing, because Israel didn't just want to be a calm and stable country, it wanted to become one of the most advanced economies in the world. So how did it do it? Let's think for a moment. What did Israel have in the early 1990s? Well, it had a fairly high level of human capital. After the Second World War, educated Jews from all over the world came to Israel. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, huge numbers of scientists arrived too, with all kinds of skills and knowledge. But Israel also had, although it might seem like a disadvantage, enemies all around. The truth is that ideology plays a big role in understanding the modernization and economic success of many countries in recent decades. We're not talking about countries that were lucky enough to be part of the first wave of developed nations, those that modernized their economies in the 19th century. For countries that developed later, it was important to have a deep belief in progress, shared both by the people and by the politicians. This happened in Japan, in South Korea, and also in Israel. In other words, society must clearly understand that development is important and that it can't be sacrificed for short-term personal interests. In Israel, the dominant idea wasn't just to survive in their own land. It was also to build a developed, competitive, highly technological, and self-sufficient economy. It had to be self-sufficient in terms of natural resources, capital markets, food, and of course, security. All this required non-traditional ways of planning reforms and powerful strategies to push development forward. Israel wanted to build a high-tech economy that would allow it to defend itself in a hostile environment and have the resources to grow on its own. In the early 1990s, the Israeli government realized that in the private sector, there were several small companies and promising projects that often ended up failing because they lacked capital. There were also people in Israel with good ideas, talent, and an entrepreneurial spirit, but not enough money to bring their projects to life. They understood that someone had to help develop those potentially huge tech projects, and that they also needed to attract the best scientists, the best engineers, and the best companies from the West. But how could they make a small country in the middle of the desert seem attractive? It wouldn't be enough to just lower taxes or cut red tape, like Ireland had done, for example. Something more was needed. Someone had to invest huge amounts of money to develop big tech projects. But in a country with a medium-level economy and a small, weak capital market, how could they invest enough to become a rich and tech-driven economy? The most obvious answer was that the state had to do it. But in Israel, they understood very well how risky it is to rely only on government investments. The government needed to keep public spending under control. Also, wherever the state is involved, there are high risks of inefficiency and corruption, and that's not ideal for a country trying to build a cutting-edge, high-tech economy, because one mistake could cost everything. If they failed to build an effective venture capital market from the start, there wouldn't be a second chance. The trust of global investors could be lost forever. So what did they do? They launched the Yozma project, which means initiative in Hebrew. It was a kind of venture capital fund of funds created to invest in promising tech projects. They assigned $100 million divided equally among the participating funds. But the public funding came with conditions. First, each fund had to be managed by both an Israeli partner and an American or European partner with a strong reputation and experience in the tech sector. The idea was for Israeli partners to learn from the venture capital experience of their international colleagues. Second, the funds team had to include 3 groups: Israeli venture capitalists in training, representatives from foreign funds, and representatives from Israeli banks or investment companies. Lastly, the Israeli partners had to raise $16 million in private capital for their fund. Only then would the government provide $8 million in public funding. The government kept its share in the funds, but after just 5 years, if the fund was successful, the private partners could buy out the state's share at the original price, plus a small extra fee. It was the perfect idea. On one hand, the government shared the risk of investing in tech projects, making it less risky. On the other hand, investors had a real chance to earn big rewards if they were successful. Also, investments in these venture capital funds came with several tax breaks. Instead of just handing out money to whoever asked, Israel chose to create a full, private venture capital market, a system where nothing was guaranteed, and so selection had to be strict and professional. Plus, Israeli fund managers learned from the best in the world. And it all worked. Yozma created the level of trust needed for foreign venture capitalists to start investing actively in Israel's tech future. The government, in practice, ended up financing high-tech investment for free. The $100 million from the government attracted more than $3 billion into Israel and built the image of a country that was attractive for investors. Today, Israel is known as the startup nation, with more than 7,000 startups currently active, the country with the most startups per capita in the world. According to the specialized magazine Fast Company, 4 Israeli companies were ranked among the 50 most innovative companies in the world in 2024. Israel is also one of the countries with the highest number of registered patents, even though it has a population of just over 9 million people. Along with this, other additional measures were introduced, such as a tax cut for tech companies. These companies went from paying 23% in taxes to just 7.5%. There was also massive investment in scientific infrastructure, like public universities and startup incubators, and a large effort to attract skilled immigrants, and a major reduction in bureaucracy. All of this helped science and technology become the strongest sector in the country. Investments also flowed into areas that were essential for turning Israel into a high-tech and independent economy. First, agriculture, a key sector for producing food in the desert. Israel is a pioneer in advanced agricultural technologies, such as low-water irrigation systems, desert farming, salinity research, enriched compost, and crop optimization. Also in biotechnology, which works hand-in-hand with agriculture. More than 20% of Israel's high-tech industry is focused on advanced biotech, especially in the production of alternative proteins. Another key area is the military-industrial complex. Less bureaucracy, a shared national cause, and especially a shared culture are behind Israel's success in this field. In most countries, profit is the main driver of this industry. But in Israel, the interests are shared, because the technology being developed is meant to help the soldiers, who are often the sons, relatives, or friends of the company owners. And finally, cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, 2 areas that are deeply connected to Israel's focus on national security and intelligence. By the way, do you remember Histadrut? The power of the labor union federation dropped dramatically after the government nationalized the public health insurance system. Members in Histadrut collapsed, and the union, after losing power, was forced to sell off many of its assets, including a lot of companies. The country that was once founded by socialists became a full market economy, and today is a stronghold of venture capitalism. It was a 3-step process. First, Israel managed to meet the necessary conditions for modern growth. Then, it built a strong institutional system and a government that both local and foreign investors could trust. And finally, it created a modern market economy focused on high tech and innovation, with all the institutions needed to support it. This is the story of how Israel avoided economic collapse and transformed itself into one of the most developed countries in the world in just 40 years. If you liked it, don't miss the next video.